Mr. Chairman.
Honourable David Parker.
So I just have a brief contribution to make. Firstly, I was on the Select Committee and we did deal carefully, as the Minister has acknowledged, with the issue as to whether the structure should be an independent Crown entity or whether it should be an officer of Parliament. And through that process, we had a very good submission from Dave McGee QC and good submissions from people who were in favour of the Officer of Parliament model being used, which were, in the eyes of the committee, outweighed by the points that were made by Dave McGee against the Officer of Parliament model. He did make a good point, though, and that was to emphasise to us that the conventions that we have around whatever institutional arrangements we have are really important. You know, in a country that doesn't have a written constitution, and even in countries that do have written constitutions, they still rely upon often unwritten conventions as to how we administer important institutions in a way which maintains public confidence in them and public confidence in the independence and impartiality of them. And one of the ideas that was put forward by the Select Committee, reflecting a submission from Dave McGee QC, was that we have some more rigour around the process in which we appoint people who aren't officers of Parliament, who are being appointed by Parliament to independent Crown entities. And I know that the Minister has come forward with a letter dated the 28th of April setting out how he proposes to make the first appointments to this commission, but I think that the underlying point that Dave McGee made about how there should be perhaps some change to standing orders so as to regularise the way in which we make these appointments to this body, but other bodies such as the Abortion Supervisory Committee and the Police Complaints Authority, so that we have we can have greater public confidence that these processes will be continued impartially into the future. The other point I would make is just a one more general, and that is that, yes, it is good that we are aiming for a consensus around these laws, but there was some justification in the criticisms that were made by the then opposition National Party of our last reforms of electoral financing law about how some of that went too far in the absence of a consensus, and on that basis the Minister retreated back to a consensus in respect of electoral financing and has run a process to change that going forward. But what's become apparent to me through that process is if you use the status quo as the foundation in the absence of a consensus for change, the government can always resist changes which they don't think are in their interests and say that there is no consensus because we don't agree. And so I think rather than the need for a consensus, I actually think that there's a need for give and take so that you arrive at a consensus where we give a bit on one side and other parties of opposing views give a bit on their side, that you can reach a consensus. And where I think that this is coming at us is actually in respect of the issue of which is unresolved in our law, and it's the issue of third-party campaigning. Now, I know that we have a different view as to what should be the rigours of control of third-party campaigning compared with the National Party in this, but I also know that the Royal Commission said that in the absence of some controls on third-party campaigning, it makes a nonsense of having controls on political party campaigning, because political parties can just go and use another vehicle that's related to them. Doesn't have to be even unrelated. They can control it, and it can be completely unrestricted in the way it campaigns. Now that seems to me to make both a mockery of the purpose underlying election finance rules, and is an example, if that prevails in the legislation that comes out of the Select Committee, is an example of where the government will be withholding a consensus, effectively saying it's not in our interest, we will stick with the status quo. And I don't think that's what I mean, or most New Zealanders would think is meant by trying to reach fair electoral laws which have a broad consensus around them. So that's not specific to this bill, and I do value the work that the Minister has done, and I just think that there's a need for a wee bit of give and take on the part of the National Party on that particular issue.
Mr. Chairman.
Honourable Simon Power.
Perhaps I could just address to